Peppa, George, and little Evie snuggled comfortably in bed. A bedtime story, the perfect end to the day. Peppa's gaze drifted toward the bedroom door, behind which something was awakening.
I'll check the kitchen. Quickly, go to sleep.
Said Mommy Pig, but she never returned.
Mom!
George and Evie looked anxiously into the semi-darkness of the corridor. The call of darkness came from there. Peppa took Evie's hand and they stepped forward into the unknown. Dark streams flowed down the walls. Each step could be their last.
Mom, where are you?
And the darkness answered. Suddenly, a splash. Ink began to rise upward. From the droplets, a silhouette appeared, almost reaching the ceiling. A thin body, tentacle-like arms covered with cracks. Two blazing red orbs for eyes. A mouth twisted into a crooked, predatory grin. Black liquid dripping from its fangs. It knows where you are and is waiting for its moment. The monster's tentacles suddenly swept at George and Evie. Peppa screamed in horror, reaching out for them, but her hands passed through the black mass. It doesn't eat, it transforms. George and Evie disappeared into the ink-like mass, and after a second, they reappeared, but already changed. Their eyes were completely black, their smiles unnaturally wide, their skin gray. Now they are his servants.
Play with us, Peppa.
Suddenly, from the depths of the corridor, Mommy and Daddy emerged, distorted, their faces smeared, eyes black, with traces of black liquid in the corners of their mouths. Even loved ones have become strangers, and now she is alone. The Midnight Visitor. This deleted episode of Peppa Pig was never aired on TV. It all started when Peppa and George heard strange footsteps coming from the hallway during the night. The footsteps were slow and heavy, like someone was wandering around the house, but the house was quiet and dark. Peppa and George got out of bed and quietly walked towards the door. In the hallway, they saw a shadowy figure in the shape of a pig, but its outline was blurred, and the shape seemed too large for a normal person. Peppa and George froze in fear. George, who is that? Is that Daddy Pig? Peppa whispered, her voice trembling. They rushed to wake their parents, but Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig were sound asleep, not reacting to their calls. The children turned back to the door, but the shadow had disappeared, leaving behind only the smell of fresh earth in the air. What is that smell? It's like fresh dirt, Peppa said, her voice full of confusion and fear. Unable to understand what was happening, Peppa and George decided to follow the shadow. They went out into the garden and discovered a freshly dug grave with a headstone that read, "Here lies Peppa Pig." The earth around the grave was still warm, as if it had been recently dug. "Peppa, what's going on? Why does it say your name?" George whispered, his voice filled with panic. Panicking, they ran to their neighbors, hoping to find someone alive. But as they reached the village, they realized it was empty. All the houses were locked, and the streets were deserted. It seemed like everyone had disappeared. Where is everyone? Why is the village empty? Peppa asked, her heart racing. When they returned home, they saw a figure rising from the ground beneath their house. It was a figure in a shroud, resembling them, but with hollow eyes and an eerie smile. The figure slowly moved toward them and waved, as if inviting them to join. "Peppa, is that us?" George cried, horrified. The figure took another step closer, and Peppa and George stood frozen, unable to move. They realized that this figure was not just a mirror image. It was them, but twisted and dark, and it was coming for them. They understood they had been trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. "We can't escape. This isn't us. It's some kind of nightmare," Peppa shouted in panic. As they tried to flee, everything around them faded into darkness. Their home, their familiar world, vanished, leaving only shadows that pulled them into this twisted, eerie reality. Their ghosts would remain forever trapped in this haunting world. Deleted episode of Peppa Pig, the ominous song. This episode was never aired on TV. It all started when Peppa and George found an old music box in a chest in the attic. George accidentally wound it up, and a strange, unnatural melody began to play. The music was eerie, almost as if it shouldn't be heard at that moment. The music grew louder, and the air in the room turned cold and heavy. Suddenly, the walls began to ripple as though they were breathing. Shadows on the walls began to come alive, stretching into odd, twisted shapes that moved around the room. Peppa and George noticed their reflections in the mirror had become distorted. Their eyes were enormous, and their smiles twisted into something unnatural, like they weren't their own. "I can't take this anymore," whispered Peppa, grabbing George's hand. But when they tried to leave, the door was locked. The music grew louder, and the room began to fill with darkness. At that moment, Papa Pig rushed into the room, his face twisted in a strange smile. He saw the music box and said with surprise, "This is my old music box. I thought I lost it years ago." But his voice was different, deep and unnatural. "Papa, what's happening to you?" asked Peppa in fear. As soon as Papa Pig touched the box, his body began to distort. His face twisted, his eyes darkened, and his arms elongated unnaturally. "Now I can play again," he whispered, and his laugh, low and metallic, filled the room. Peppa and George watched in horror as Papa Pig lost all human form, his body collapsing into a shadow that couldn't stop moving. "I can't stop it," he said, and his figure faded into the darkness, swallowed by emptiness. The box started playing again. The music became unbearably loud, echoing through the room as if the room itself was alive. The walls cracked, and the shadows grew more menacing. Suddenly, Peppa and George felt something pulling them inside. They couldn't move, couldn't resist. "What's happening?" screamed George, but his voice was drowned by the music. At that moment, everything around them turned dark, and the room disappeared. Instead, they found themselves in an endless void, an abyss, where there was nothing but the sound of the music. Inside the box, everything was closed off, consuming them into its vast depths. Peppa and George stood in this nightmarish void, surrounded by dark shadows that wouldn't let them go. Their bodies grew heavier, and the music became more unbearable, as if it were a part of this endless darkness. "Are we stuck here forever?" whispered Peppa. And just as they tried to speak their last words, everything around them dissolved into the darkness, and the sound of the box merged with the silence. The music stopped, and the episode ended. Deleted Peppa Pig episode, The Spider. This Peppa Pig episode was never aired on television. It was removed. And now it's clear why. It all started like a normal day. George was playing on the carpet, Peppa was organizing her toys, and Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Mummy Pig was cooking breakfast. Everything felt calm, until George screamed. He said something had bitten him on his leg, 2 tiny puncture marks. No one paid much attention. A few hours later, George became sluggish. His face turned pale. He wasn't talking or eating. He just sat, breathing heavily. By evening, he stopped moving. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange noise. There was a rustling sound coming from the living room. George's bed was empty. Peppa went to look for him, and she found him. In the corner of the living room hung a web, huge like a tent, and inside it, George. He was stuck to the wall with webbing. His eyes were open, black, but he didn't move. His stomach was swollen. Something was moving inside. An hour later, Daddy Pig disappeared. Then Mummy Pig. Peppa was alone. The web was growing. It wrapped around furniture, walls, and the ceiling. The house was turning into a cocoon. She heard breathing. Behind her. She turned. The spider. Huge. Black. Hairy. Crawling along the walls. It moved toward George. One leg touched his stomach. The swelling cracked open. From inside crawled a small spider. Spider-like. With a monstrous version of George's face. It twitched. Peppa ran to her room. The last thing she saw, her parents already hanging from the ceiling. Then she saw their faces, distorted and terrifying. Threads were pulling out of their mouths. This is a lost episode that was never aired on TV. It all began on a normal day. Peppa lost one of her baby teeth. "Hooray!" she shouted, "Dad. Now the tooth fairy will bring me a gift." Mummy Pig smiled. "Put the tooth under your pillow, dear. There'll be a surprise in the morning." That night, Peppa woke up. The room was dark, but something felt wrong. She heard a crunching sound from under her pillow. When she lifted it, the tooth was gone, but there was no gift either. Only a strange white lump, like it was made of bones. The next day, George complained about a toothache. Then Mummy Pig, then Daddy Pig. They all said, "Maybe we ate something bad." That night, Peppa woke up again, but not from the crunch. This time, from breathing. Someone was sitting by her bed, a figure, gray, far too tall, with long arms and a grin that stretched ear to ear. "Do you brush your teeth well, Peppa?" it whispered. "You give them to me, one by one, every night." Peppa screamed, but no one came. George was asleep with his mouth open. His front teeth were missing. Mummy was standing in the hallway, smiling. On her cheek, a white patch like bone powder. Peppa ran to the mirror. On her face, new teeth were growing, but not hers. A third row, sharp, wrong. She ran back to the bedroom. Everyone's teeth were falling out, more and more every second, and someone stood in the corner. That same figure, but its face. Oh, God. Grandpa's letter. One day, our grandfather left and never came back. We searched for him, but it was no use. Half a year later, while going through his closet, I picked up Grandpa's coat and felt something in the pocket. I reached in, unfolded a note, and saw his handwriting. It said, "My dear ones, this is not a farewell, not a will. It's a joke. I've been living in the forest with an old friend you've never met. Here's the address. Once you find this letter, come visit. I want to see your faces." A week later, we drove to the coordinates. The forest was deep, the road broken, no signal. The house was real, wooden, old. Inside, it smelled like firewood. We waited an hour, then 2. Night fell quickly. Something rustled outside. Dad went to check. He didn't come back. We were alone. George noticed. One of the cups was empty. Peppa turned around, but she wasn't looking at Mom anymore. She was staring at something behind her. The deleted episode of Peppa Pig. The porcelain doll. Peppa finds an old, dusty toy box in the attic. Inside is a large doll with a porcelain face, but it doesn't have a face, just a smooth white oval. "What a strange doll," says Peppa, looking at her. George looks at the doll with apprehension and hides behind his mother. At night, it seems to Peppa that the doll is looking at her. She hears quiet whispers from her room, even though no one is there. The next morning, the doll is in a different place. Peppa tries to get rid of the doll, but it always comes back. One day, while playing with George, Peppa draws the doll's face with a marker pen. At first, it's funny, but at night, the face on the doll changes. Now it's an evil grimace with sharp teeth and glowing red eyes. Peppa is terrified. She realizes that the doll is alive and something bad is happening. She runs to Mama Piggy, but she doesn't believe her. At night, Peppa wakes up from the cold. She sees a doll by her bed. The doll stretches its porcelain hand towards her. Peppa screams, but no one comes. In the morning, Peppa disappears. George is playing alone in the garden, but he is no longer grunting with joy. He holds a faceless doll in his hands. Piggy's mom and dad are standing at the window, their faces full of despair. Their voices are barely audible. Where is our Peppa? Deleted Peppa Pig episode, The Living Toy. George loved his dinosaur, but that day, the toy fell into a place where it shouldn't have gone. George didn't know. Some toys find their owners on their own. When George disappeared, Peppa decided to look for him, but she had no idea. She would have to search not for her brother, but for what had taken him. The trail led to the nursery, where it all began. The door to the nursery swung open, and Peppa saw a giant dinosaur holding George in its claws.
Give him back!
Peppa shouted, but the dinosaur already knew his name. Peppa tried to rescue her brother, but the dinosaur swatted her away with its tail. George mumbled. His voice sounded strange, as if the dinosaur was learning how to be him. Peppa grabbed a toy hammer and struck the dinosaur's paw. It dropped George.
Run!
Peppa yelled, but George didn't move. His eyes turned red. In the morning, George returned, but Peppa saw that now the dinosaur was always watching him. At night, a voice was heard behind the door.
The little dinosaur. Mine.
He waiting, because children can be lost so easily, especially when they think they've been found. Deleted episode of Peppa Pig, The Evil Force. An ordinary day, Peppa decided to draw, starting with a simple apple. But something went wrong, and the apple simply dissolved into reality. Peppa couldn't believe her eyes. Her desire to test her new power led to the next step. Each new drawing disappeared from her world. Soon,
Wow!
Peppa realized her power knew no bounds. She left home in the name of experimentation and set a new goal: the school. Every stroke of her marker became a new threat. The school began to vanish from reality. The facade flickered and dissolved away. Peppa looked at the empty field. She felt like a god in a world of ink, but someone was watching her, always watching. Peppa sensed that something was wrong and decided to return, but what she saw shocked her, freezing her with fear. The room seemed empty, but that was a lie. Sitting before her was her doppelganger, drawing something. With each stroke, he recreated her appearance, frightening and alien. Peppa froze in horror, realizing her power had gained its own will. The doppelganger looked at her with hollow eyes as she slowly dissolved into the space, unable to save herself. A typical evening, tea, girlfriends, nothing foreshadowed trouble. The light bulb suddenly began to flicker. The girls fell silent and looked up. The first alarm. The house had awakened. Susie began to tremble. The hum grew louder. The shadows became restless. The shadow beneath Susie's chair pulsed and darkened. Susie screamed, dropping her doll. Peppa grabbed Susie's hand. The shadow reached for Susie's leg. The kitchen turned into a trap. The girls ran into the living room. The room was quiet. The silence was deceptive. The couch's shadow melted onto the floor, turning into a flat black puddle. It slowly spread across the floor. From its center rose something, like a shapeless ink-blot tentacle. Susie stared in horror. Peppa recoiled. The puddle slid toward them, stretching. Peppa shoved Susie toward the hallway door, but escape was a lie. Darkness awaited them there too. A mass of wallpaper was already partly oozing down under the stairs. An eye on a tentacle stared at them. The Shadow Eater had seeped out of the living room, Peppa and Susie ran toward the staircase. The eater tried to cut them off, sliding along the wall. Susie nearly fell. The pounding of footsteps, heavy breathing, the rising sounds of monsters. Peppa pulled Susie into the nursery and slammed the door. Black liquid seeped from underneath. A message appeared on the wall. "We are in the walls." George was there too. Black film covered his mouth. His black eyes shot open. The darkness had already consumed him. George's shadow tore away from the wall, forming a new eater. Susie screamed in terror. Peppa spotted a flashlight on the dresser. Bright light! In the flashlight beam, the shadow eater recoiled, writhing as it slithered under the door. The wallpaper, a giant mass with eyes, was stuck to the outside window. The flashlight flickered wildly and died. A wet, slurping sound echoed in the dark. Suddenly, Peppa's face with black eyes. "Your house has consumed the light.